As of today, total global debt stands at approximately 317 trillion USD, a figure so large it exceeds 330% of global GDP. In other words, for every $1 the world produces in goods and services, it owes more than $3 in accumulated liabilities. This is not the condition of a few mismanaged states. It is universal. The United States carries over 36 trillion USD in sovereign debt. China owes more than 15 trillion USD. Japan, long considered the archetype of debt sustainability, exceeds 10 trillion USD. Across the Atlantic, the combined public and private obligations of the European Union amount to tens of trillions more. There is no major economy operating outside this condition. Every engine of global growth is also a balance sheet of accumulated promises to pay. This creates a paradox that is rarely confronted. Debt is not an abstract number, it is a contract. For every borrower, there must be a lender. If the world owes 317 trillion USD, then 317 trillion USD in financial claims are owned by someone. Debt is a zero-sum system. Liabilities on one side cannot exist without assets on the other. Yet public discourse speaks endlessly about debtors while remaining conspicuously silent about creditors. When every major nation is described as in debt, the implicit assumption is that debt is diffuse, mutual, and shared. It is not. The question that matters is not how much the world owes, but who the world owes it to. Until that question is answered, global debt appears as an unfortunate outcome of modern economics. Once it is asked, debt begins to look less like an accident and more like an architecture. Once this reality is acknowledged, the next step is unavoidable. Debt is not a collective burden floating in the abstract. It is a zero-sum system. Every liability recorded on one balance sheet must appear as an asset on another. There is no exception to this rule. If global debt totals 317 trillion USD, then 317 trillion USD in financial claims exist simultaneously, owned, held, and enforced by someone. Debt does not disappear into the system. It changes hands. It consolidates, it accumulates. When governments, corporations, and households are described as owing vast sums, what is being described indirectly is the existence of an equally vast stock of wealth on the opposite side of the ledger. This is where public understanding breaks down. Debt is often framed as a shared condition. Everyone owes, therefore everyone is equally exposed. That framing is mathematically false. A zero-sum structure does not distribute outcomes evenly. It polarizes them. If one side of the system carries obligations, the other side holds enforceable claims. If the world owes 317 trillion USD, then someone owns 317 trillion USD in interest-bearing assets. Bonds, loans, securities, and contractual promises to pay do not dissolve because they are large. They concentrate precisely because they are large. Yet discussions about global debt almost never ask the most important question. Attention remains fixed on borrowers. Which country is over-leveraged? Which household is struggling? Which corporation risks default? The creditors are treated as invisible, neutral, or incidental. They are not. Debt cannot exist without ownership, and ownership is never evenly distributed. Financial assets follow the same pattern as all forms of capital. They move towards scale, liquidity, and control. Over time, claims consolidate in fewer hands, not more. This is the central question that transforms debt from an economic statistic into a power structure. Who holds the 317 trillion USD in assets that correspond to the world's liabilities? Until that question is answered, global debt appears as a technical problem. Once it is asked, debt reveals itself as a map of ownership and a hierarchy of control. To answer that question honestly, one assumption must first be dismantled. Most people instinctively understand debt through the lens of personal borrowing. You borrow $10,000 from a bank, the bank already has the money, you repay the principal plus interest. The transaction feels intuitive, limited, and reversible. This model does not describe modern sovereign debt at all. When governments borrow, the money does not exist beforehand. It is created at the moment of borrowing. When a government issues bonds, those bonds are purchased by central banks and commercial banks that generate the funds through accounting entries, not prior savings. A balance sheet expands. Numbers are typed. Money appears. Consider a simplified example. A government needs 1 trillion USD. It issues bonds. The central bank, such as the Federal Reserve, purchases a portion of those bonds by crediting bank reserves. Commercial banks purchase the remainder by expanding deposits. In both cases, the money is created through the act of lending itself. There was no pool of idle capital waiting to be deployed. The borrowing event is the creation event. This is the foundation of modern monetary systems. But here is the critical asymmetry that defines everything that follows. Only the principal is created. The interest is not. If 1 trillion USD is borrowed at 5%, the system creates 1 trillion USD in new money, but it demands 1.05 trillion USD in repayment after 1 year. That additional 50 billion USD does not exist anywhere in the system. It must be obtained from elsewhere through taxation, asset sales, or most commonly, new borrowing. This transforms debt from a temporary obligation into a structural necessity. Because interest is never created alongside principal, total debt must always exceed total money. Repayment in full is mathematically impossible at the system level. New debt is required simply to service old debt. This is not a malfunction. It is the operating logic of modern finance and the mechanism through which debt becomes permanent. Once this asymmetry is understood, the full structure of the debt system becomes impossible to ignore. Because interest is never created alongside principal, total debt must always exceed the total money supply. This is the system's core mathematical constraint. If 1 trillion USD is created through borrowing, but 1.05 trillion USD is owed, the system is instantly short 50 billion USD. That shortfall is not temporary, it is permanent. It exists by design, not by error. At the aggregate level, there is never enough money in circulation to repay all outstanding debts plus interest. The gap cannot be closed. This leads to the next inevitability. To pay interest on existing debt, new debt must be created. Governments borrow to service prior obligations. Corporations refinance to roll over liabilities. Households take on new loans to remain current on old ones. The system does not permit deleveraging in aggregate. It only allows substitution. Old debt is replaced with new debt, larger than before. The principal grows because the interest must be absorbed into fresh borrowing. Debt therefore expands not because borrowers are irresponsible, but because repayment without expansion is mathematically impossible. This is why global debt never stabilizes. It can slow temporarily, but it cannot stop. If new borrowing were halted, interest payments would immediately drain liquidity from the system. Defaults would cascade, asset prices would collapse, banks would fail, governments would lose funding, the system would seize. To prevent collapse, debt creation must continue. Growth in debt is not optional, it is compulsory. This is the debt trap. Not a political trap, not a moral trap, a mathematical one. Global debt has risen from approximately 40 trillion USD in 1990 to 317 trillion USD today. Nearly an 8x increase in just over 3 decades. The pace is not accidental. Debt must grow faster than the economy because interest compounds while production does not. The system therefore enforces a single trajectory, perpetual expansion until the limits of solvency are reached. Stagnation is collapse. Stability is illusion. Growth in debt is the only state the system can tolerate. Once it becomes clear that the debt system cannot stop expanding, the final issue is no longer technical, it is structural. If debt must grow forever, someone must be positioned to own it forever. Debt expansion without ownership would be meaningless. In practice, global credit is not held by society at large. It is concentrated into 4 primary creditor groups, each sitting at a higher layer of control. The first and most foundational group is central banks. Institutions such as the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan collectively hold over 25 trillion USD in government bonds. By creating money to purchase sovereign debt, they anchor the entire system. Governments become dependent on continuous bond issuance, and taxpayers become permanently responsible for interest payments. This layer defines the rules under which all other creditors operate. The second group consists of institutional investors. Pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and large asset managers together control more than 120 trillion USD in debt instruments. Pension funds alone hold roughly 50 trillion USD, while insurance companies hold around 35 trillion USD. Asset managers such as BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street oversee more than 20 trillion USD combined. Although these institutions are often presented as neutral custodians of public savings, control rests with management and shareholders. Ownership of these firms is heavily concentrated. The top 10% of households control nearly 90% of financial assets. Interest income flows accordingly. The third category is foreign governments. Approximately 30 trillion USD of global debt is held by states lending to other states, largely through trade imbalances. China and Japan together hold over 2 trillion USD in foreign sovereign bonds, primarily U.S. treasuries. These assets are not owned by citizens. They are controlled by state elites and monetary authorities. At the top sit wealthy individuals and dynastic families. The top 1% globally holds about 40 trillion USD in financial assets, much of it in bonds and fixed income instruments. These four groups dominate global credit. The outcome is not accidental inequality, but concentrated control. Debt ensures that income flows upward continuously, while ownership of the system itself remains locked in the hands of a very small minority. Once the identity of the world's creditors is understood, the function of debt becomes unmistakable. Debt is not merely a financing tool, it is a mechanism for concentrating wealth. The roles within this system are asymmetrical and persistent. On one side stand the poor and the middle class. They borrow to survive and to participate in modern life. Mortgages to access housing, student loans to access education, consumer credit to smooth stagnant wages. They repay principal, pay interest, and fund public debt through taxation. On the other side stand the wealthy. They do not borrow to live, they lend to earn. They hold bonds, structured credit products, and fixed income securities. They collect interest, then reinvest that interest to acquire more assets that generate even more interest. The numbers reveal the direction of the flow. Globally, households hold roughly 60 trillion USD in debt and pay approximately 3 trillion USD in interest each year. Governments collectively pay over 1.2 trillion USD annually in interest, with the United States alone paying close to 900 billion USD. Corporations add another 5 trillion USD in annual interest payments. In total, more than 15 trillion USD flows upward every year from taxpayers, workers, and consumers to creditors. This is not an incidental transfer, it is a structural one. The distribution of that income is highly concentrated. The top 1% of the global population captures roughly 40% of all interest income. The top 0.1% captures around 20%. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% holds almost no financial assets at all. They hold liabilities, not claims. They are structurally positioned as payers, not receivers. This imbalance compounds over time. Interest income grows faster than wages. Asset values grow faster than productivity. The rich do not need to increase effort to increase income. Ownership alone is sufficient. This is how debt converts inequality into permanence. Borrowers must keep working to remain solvent. Lenders accumulate claims that work on their behalf. The system does not require exploitation by force. It requires only contracts, interest, and time. Over decades, the result is predictable. Wealth flows continuously from the many to the few, not as an exception, but as the normal operation of the debt-based economy. Once debt is understood as a mechanism of wealth concentration, history stops looking chaotic and begins to look repetitive. The structure has changed, but the outcome has not. For more than 700 years, the same pattern has resurfaced across different eras, institutions, and technologies. In medieval Europe, between 1200 and 1500, the primary creditor was the Catholic Church. Kings and monarchs borrowed heavily to finance wars and administration. When debts could not be repaid, land was transferred instead. By the early 1500s, the Church controlled an estimated 25% of all land in Europe, much of it acquired through debt enforcement rather than conquest. Sovereigns ruled, but creditors owned. During the Renaissance, the role of lender shifted from religious institutions to banking families. In 15th century Italy, the Medici family built unprecedented power by lending to monarchs, merchants, and even the papacy. Interest income quickly surpassed profits from trade or production. By 1450, the Medici were wealthy enough to install popes and influence European politics directly. Lending did not merely generate wealth, it generated control. Those who borrowed governed day-to-day affairs. Those who lent shaped outcomes. The modern era did not break this pattern, it formalized it. Beginning in 1694 with the creation of the Bank of England, debt was institutionalized through central banking. Governments gained access to permanent borrowing. Creditors gained permanent interest income backed by taxation. Today, central banks, institutional investors, and financial elites occupy the same structural position once held by churches and dynasties. The scale is larger, the instruments more complex, but the hierarchy is unchanged. Across centuries, the conclusion remains consistent. Borrowers carry obligations. Lenders accumulate leverage. Empires rise and fall. Currencies change. Political systems evolve. But the rule persists. Those who control credit outlast those who rely on it. History does not show random outcomes. It shows a recurring truth. The lender always wins. The borrower always adapts. And dependence, once established, rarely disappears. Once this historical pattern is recognized, the role of interest becomes impossible to dismiss. Interest is not a neutral price of money, it is the primary tool through which wealth is transferred upward. In the modern economy, this transfer operates quietly, automatically, and at enormous scale. Each year, global borrowers, governments, corporations, and households pay approximately 15 trillion USD in interest alone. This is not repayment of principal. It is a recurring charge for access to capital. Taxes fund it, wages fund it, consumer prices embed it. Interest is woven into nearly every transaction in the economy. The distribution of this flow is highly asymmetric. Roughly 40% of global interest income accrues to the top 1% of asset holders. The top 0.1% capture close to 20%, and the top 0.01%, fewer than 1 million people worldwide, receive more than 10%. For these groups, interest is not supplemental income. It is the core engine of wealth expansion. A portfolio of 10 billion USD earning 4% generates 400 million USD per year without labor, production, or risk-taking comparable to entrepreneurship. That income is then reinvested into additional bonds and assets, compounding future returns. Wealth grows exponentially because ownership compounds while effort does not. For borrowers, the experience is fundamentally different. Interest payments do not compound opportunity. They compound constraint. Households earning $70,000 annually may pay $20,000 in combined mortgage, consumer, and indirect interest, surrendering nearly 30% of income to creditors. Governments divert hundreds of billions from public services to debt service. Corporations extract value from labor and consumers to meet interest obligations. The result is stagnation at the base and acceleration at the top. This is why inequality persists, even during economic growth. Productivity gains are absorbed by interest claims before they reach wages. Growth feeds creditors first. Over time, debtors remain trapped in maintenance mode, working to stay solvent, while creditors move further ahead each cycle. Interest transforms temporary advantage into permanent dominance. It ensures that wealth accumulates geometrically for lenders, while borrowers remain locked into linear struggle. This is not a side effect of the system. It is its most reliable outcome. Once interest is recognized as the engine of upward wealth transfer, the final illusion collapses. The global debt system is not designed to be repaid. Repayment is not the goal. Permanence is. Debt is commonly treated as a policy failure or a temporary excess. But at the system level, it is neither. Debt is a feature, not a flaw. The architecture ensures that obligations outlive borrowers and that interest outlives principal. As long as debt exists, interest flows. And as long as interest flows, wealth concentrates. The objective is simple and consistent: perpetual interest and perpetual transfer. Because interest is never created with principal, total debt can never be extinguished. Attempts to reduce it merely shift the burden. Austerity extracts more from taxpayers. Inflation erodes purchasing power. Defaults redistribute assets. In every scenario, obligations are resolved not by elimination, but by conversion, often at the expense of those with the least protection. Even collapse does not reverse the hierarchy. When debt systems break, asset prices fall. Borrowers default. Liquidity disappears. But creditors, holding capital, diversification, and mobility, acquire assets at discounted values. This occurred in 1929, in 2008, and it will occur again. The middle class holds wages, pensions, and local currency. The wealthy hold claims, assets, and alternatives. Crises do not destroy this system. They complete its cycle. Debt, therefore, is not a temporary imbalance awaiting correction. It is a durable mechanism engineered to function in expansion and in failure alike. The system does not ask whether wealth will concentrate. It only determines how fast and under what conditions it will do so. Once it is accepted that the debt system is designed for permanence, the final outcome becomes a question of form, not direction. There are only three possible endings. The first is default. Governments or institutions fail to honor obligations. Debts are written off. Assets collapse in value. The immediate damage falls on workers, pension holders, and savers whose wealth is tied to wages, promises, and paper claims. Creditors with liquidity acquire real assets at distressed prices. Ownership concentrates further. The second path is inflation. Debts are repaid in debased currency. Purchasing power erodes. Savings lose value. Wages lag prices. Asset holders, protected by real estate, equities, commodities, and global diversification, preserve wealth while the middle class absorbs the loss. The third option is debt jubilee. Obligations are canceled or restructured. On paper, this appears equitable. In practice, those with leverage, legal access, and political influence secure exemptions, conversions, or compensation, while ordinary holders of pensions and savings bear the adjustment. These outcomes differ in appearance, but not in consequence. In all three cases, the middle class is compressed and the creditor class is insulated. This is not coincidence, it is structural. The system was built to extract wealth during expansion and to preserve dominance during collapse. Debt determines the path, ownership determines the destination. The end game, therefore, is not about avoiding crisis, it is about who is positioned to endure it. If this analysis changed how you see debt, power, and wealth, leave a comment with your perspective. And if you want to understand what comes next and how these cycles have ended before, subscribe to the channel for the next part of the series.